This is GARIS, masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 437, part 2, entitled The Insufferable Unconscious Arrogance of MFBs. That's Monoconscious Feminazi Bigots. Carrying straight on. The human female is the sexiest of mammals, having every day of the month a day of sexual heat, unlike female monkeys or dogs, who have only a few days of the month or season in sexual heat. So speaking as a masculist, who is aware of these things, listening to you feminists harping endlessly on your relatively minor complaints about how men oppress women, when in reality you women oppress men far worse, since your decades-lasting manslaving parasitism is a hugely greater gender crime than anything you women are subject to by men. So you feminists can expect increasingly that as more and more men have their masculist consciousness raised, they will become increasingly angry and hateful at you for your hated, ignorant, insufferable monoconsciousness. That is, that you have only had your feminist consciousness raised and know nothing about how men oppress women, and in fact far worse than vice versa. Masculists push women to take the masculist chair test, which was designed to force women to recognise that women do indeed oppress men far worse than vice versa. For those of you feminists who have not already heard of the masculist chair test, it goes as follows. You are sitting as a feminist in a chair, with a masculist standing over you with a gun at your head, forcing you to make a choice between two options at the count of 3 or he blows your brains out. The two choices are between being raped or being enslaved by a man, working for him for free, no kids, and for 3 decades. Most women choose to be raped, arguing that being raped is a much lesser gender crime against the woman than being enslaved by a man for 3 whole decades. The masculist then points out that it then logically follows that women oppress men worse than vice versa, since fluffies manslave men for decades, a far greater gender crime. So feminists expect men increasingly to harangue you out of the room if you keep harping on your minor gender crimes committed against you by men, when you women commit far greater gender crimes against men. For example, what you fluffy feminist hypocrites are doing to men in the divorce courts, in brackets, forcing a man to give up custody of his kids in 90% of cases, giving his house to his ex-wife so she can raise her kids in them, paying for kids he will barely see, handing over half of his stuff to her, half his wealth to her. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy parasite, he may have to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat, parasitic ass and fip up. Thus she continues to parasite off his money and labour for the rest of his life. This is a hugely greater gender crime than anything you feminists complain about. 80% of young women at the critical age of 16 choose to become fluffy crappers, studying fluffy crap majors at high school, and hence are forced to study more fluffy crap at college, ending up with a fluffy crap diploma that the economy does not value, so then expects to parasite off the money and labour of a man as a hated, manslaving, fluffy parasite. Masculists want high schools of both sexes to compulsorily study calculus, as was the case in the Soviet Union, so that young women are not excluded from studying STEM, S-T-E-M, science, tech, engineering, math, and the professions at university, so that a much higher percentage of women end up with career-competent diplomas, giving them a real skill that the economy values and pays well for, so that women end up as FIPs as adults, pulling their financial weight and not parasiting off a man's money and labour as a hated fluffy. Most feminists are monoconscious, that is, they have only had their feminist consciousness raised, so have been taught by feminism how men oppress women, So not surprisingly, most feminists are angry, even hateful, at men, since feminism teaches them that men are oppressors of women, so should be hated. Then along come the masculists, who say the opposite. That is, that women oppress men far worse, and that things have to change, that the gender laws have to be men-fared, or there will be a sex war. It will take some time, some years, for the monoconscious feminists to become familiar with masculist arguments, so that they convert themselves into biconscious feminists. That is, by definition, they have had both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, so that their monoconscious feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women is cancelled by a corresponding and oppositely directed masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men, especially with women's manslavery, women's many decades-lasting gender crimes against men, for example, paternity fraud. In about 5% of pregnancies, the husband is not the father. Women's pill lying, forcing fatherhood on a man who does not want the kid, thus manslaving him for decades, etc. Since masculists are abolitionists, fluffydom is a war issue, because to masculists, fluffydom is manslavery, manslavery is slavery, and slavery to masculists is hated to the point of picking up arms and shooting fluffies the way the northern US state soldiers did against the southern US state soldiers. To masculists, manslavery by fluffies is a war issue that eventually will get fluffies killed. In the meantime, that is, during the time that monoconscious feminists take to convert themselves into biconscious feminists, there will be a lot of verbal anger and hate expressed between monoconscious feminists and biconscious masculists, as the masculists become increasingly impatient with the bigotry and unconscious arrogance of monoconscious feminists, labelling them MFBs, Monoconscious Feminazi Bigots. Masculists are fed up with hearing MFBs lashing out at men for the ways that men oppress women, when masculists know from what they have learned from masculist thinkers, writers, broadcasters, teachers, etc., that in reality it is women who, in capital letters, hugely oppress men far worse with their awful decades-lasting manslavery. Masculists tell men that the core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being manslaves to women, against working for women. Masculists tell men that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery, so that now that women can work, they must work, or be seen by an increasingly masculisted world as manslavers, as vermin, as immoral and parasitic, who, if a sex war comes, deserve to be shot. As men get angrier and angrier, more and more hateful of what the fluffies and fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts are doing to men, the more verbally violent and hateful will be the confrontations between biconscious masculists and monoconscious feminists, who initially will suffer cognitive dissonance when these monoconscious feminists are first confronted by biconscious masculists who tell them the opposite of what feminism has been preaching to them for decades, that is, that only women are the gender oppressed, that only men are the gender oppressors. When masculists tell these monoconscious feminists that the reverse is more the case, then these monoconscious feminists will suffer cognitive dissonance as much as would a priest who is told by an atheist, quotes, "Mr. Priest, there's no God. You've wasted your whole life." Of course, the priest is not going to accept that idea, since it would undermine his strongest, deepest beliefs. So similarly, millions of monoconscious feminists will suffer the same gut-wrenching, sickening, existential fear of losing their monoconscious feminist beliefs that act as a form of religion to them, shaping their whole lives and worldview as they come to terms with the strength of the arguments coming from the biconscious masculists. and especially having to be confronted by very angry, hateful masculists who have lost patience with hearing the relatively minor complaints of the monoconscious feminists, when as masculists they have had their consciousness raised about the man-slavery of fluffies, the financial massacring of one father in 4 in the hated fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, the lack of a para when women have the mara, etc., etc. Probably the bottom line of this flyer is that once the COVID fog lifts, once the COVID vaccines have done their thing, then in the next few years we can expect to see at a much greater frequency ugly, verbally violent, hateful confrontations between monoconscious feminazi bigots, that's MFBs, and biconscious masculists, who have no patience and certainly no sexual desire for MFBs, who masculists see as hypocritical manslavers, as vermin, so will not be nice to these MFBs in order to penis them. So these biconscious masculists will be able to let fly their full male verbal rage at such women, biting their fucking heads off, haranguing them out of the room. Masculists are increasingly fed up with the insufferable, unconscious arrogance of monoconscious feminists, MFBs, and aim to wipe them out by forcing monoconscious feminists to convert themselves to biconscious feminists, and hence become less hateful to men, and hence more approachable by men, hence will be more likely to have boyfriends, hence will be more regularly penised, orgasmed, and loved by men, and hence will be much happier than being hated MFBs, who are punished by men as misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi bitches who rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at, until MFBs are wiped out or converted into biconscious feminists, a far more humane and desirable alternative. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 430 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.